Leadership isn't just about strategy, authority, or expertise. At its core, leadership is about communication, and the most powerful communicators are storytellers. In this episode of the Modern Leadership Solutions podcast, I'm joined by speaker, author, and storytelling expert, Dr. Danny Brassell. We explore why the best leaders use stories to connect, influence, and inspire action. This conversation will give you practical tools you can start using immediately. Let's jump in. Welcome back to the Modern Leadership Solutions podcast. Today I've got a great episode scheduled for you. I'm talking with a multi-published, highly requested speaker, and I can't wait to get into this conversation. I'd like to welcome Dr. Danny Brassell to the podcast this morning. Danny, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Tom. More importantly, thanks for all that you do. You're spreading some joy around the world, my friend.
I hope it's joy anyways, but before we get into the topic for the day, I'd really like to know a little bit more about you. Tell me a little bit about your leadership journey and how you got to this point where you are now.
Well, Tom, if I was going to write an autobiography, I'd probably call it Pivots because I feel like I've already lived 9 lives. 30 years ago, I was a journalist covering President Bush Sr. in the 1992 presidential election. I loved my job. I got to meet every editor of every major daily. And one editor offered me the city beat for $16,500 a year. Meanwhile, a friend told me they were hiring teachers in South Central Los Angeles for $25,000 a year. So I became an educator for the noblest of reasons, Tom, for the high pay. Ironically, I fell in love with teaching. I've taught all age levels from preschoolers all the way up to rocket scientists. I can make that claim because I used to teach English as a second language to engineering students at the University of Southern California. And in 2005, my wife and I attended a real estate seminar, which turned out to be a scam, and we lost everything financially. And I could give you the woe is me story, but I'm a positive person. I learned a lot from that experience. First of all, I learned that my wife is my soulmate. I put her through the ringer, and she stood right by me. She's an incredible human being. Secondly, I learned that money's not everything because you can lose money just like that. Third, I try not to judge other people, Tom, because if I was somebody who saw what I had done, I would have said, well, you deserve that. But now I realize unless you know everything about a person, you really don't know anything about a person. Fourth, I became a Christian, which I'm always embarrassed to confess. It's like a catastrophe. But the more I read the Bible, I realize I'm not the first screw up to find Jesus. And fifth, and probably most applicably for this podcast, I didn't want to file for bankruptcy. And my accountant said, well, you have to make this much more money this year. So I started speaking on the side, and I hit that number right on the number. Well, the next year, Tom, he gave me a much higher number, and I hit that number right on the number. So in year 3, I thought, well, maybe I should set a higher number. And basically, during one of the worst economic downturns in American history, I was able to build up a highly lucrative speaking business, which eventually attracted the attention of some pretty famous people and companies who wanted me to coach them. And I have to confess, I really resisted coaching for a long time, Tom, because you need to know this about me. I'm obsessive compulsive. I will not let you fail. I will be on your back, holding you accountable until you succeed. Well, now that I work with primarily entrepreneurs and executives and business owners, I find that they're highly motivated. They do the work, and it's probably been some of the most gratifying work I've ever done. So you can take me down whichever trail you choose, my friend.
Yeah, with that kind of motivation, it seems like that's exactly what you need in a coach. Those are the best coaches in my life have been the ones that have been willing to hold me accountable, even when they would rather just walk away from me. But so that's a good thing. Today, I've set the premise of this episode around a simple concept that leaders are storytellers. And I'm going to do a little bit of a lawyer routine and ask a leading question here because I think I know the answer to this. But do you agree with that statement? And if so, why would you say that's true?
Oh, it doesn't. Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't matter what field you're in. The greatest leaders are the best storytellers. And they're all readers. That's why my background in reading applies so much to my
Yeah.
storytelling. If you look in industry, some of the wealthiest people in the world, people like Elon Musk and Warren Buffett, they read all day long. If you look at the military, General Schwarzkopf was said to read every single day. He could He could read in 4 languages and quote Shakespeare voraciously. Presidents read, Bill Clinton, whenever he was stressed, he'd read a mystery novel. A lot of people forget this story. President Kennedy was at a press conference and a reporter asked him what he was reading. And he said, it's interesting. I'm reading this cool little spy novel about this guy named James Bond. Well, MGM happened to be watching that press conference. They bought the rights to 007, and that's the reason we have the James Bond movies. Uh, Even in fields like, I mean, obviously entertainment, all actors are reading all the time. If you look at athletics, Bill Belichick, probably the the most important and winningest, well, not the winningest, but one of the most winningest coaches in NFL history, has the most extensive football library. He actually donated it to his alma mater. LeBron James in basketball, I could have kissed him before the NBA Finals when he was playing with the Miami Heat. They showed him in the locker room reading The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. I just have always thought that whatever you're doing, you're going to do it a lot better if you're an effective storyteller. So that's a long answer to your very short question.
So, how would you say that your reading habit has contributed to your ability as a storyteller?
Well, some people collect stamps, Tom. Other people collect cars. I collect stories, and I'll read an entire book, and the book can stink. But if there's one little anecdote in there that was worth it, I'm totally happy. As a matter of fact, I was just reading a marketing book a couple of weeks ago about this marketer who was looking for the next big thing. He was going all around the world, and he was in Chile. He's watching these guys fish, and he notices the fish they're supposed to be catching, they're putting in one barrel, and then they have this other fish they're putting in a separate barrel, and they're eating that fish. And he says, "Oh, are you eating that fish because you're getting paid to fish the other kind?" They're like, "Well, yeah, but this is also a tastier fish." He says, "Well, may I try it?" And they're like, "Yeah, sure." So he tries it. He's like, "Oh, wow, this is really tasty. What's it called?" And they say, "The bonefish." He looks at him, the bonefish? That's the sweetest name. And he thinks about it, and he purchases it, and he introduces it into the American market. It's now the #1 selling fish at fancy restaurants across the United States. He just named he renamed the bonefish the Chilean sea bass. That was great.
Yeah, isn't that the way that great marketers work? Is they have a way of taking something like that and just turning it on its head. So you must have a huge library of stories in some format. I've got to know how do you keep up with that, with such a vast library of stories?
Well, people send me books all the time, so I'm constantly reading, and because I have eclectic taste, I'll read about anything and everything, which is a really key concept for most leaders to understand. Whatever your field is, by reading outside your field, you can take those concepts and apply them to your field. I don't know if you remember him, Tom. I'm an old guy. You got to chop off my head and count the rings at this point, but I grew up listening to Paul Harvey on the radio, and Paul Harvey is one of the people that really got me excited about storytelling. He used to come on the radio every day at 12:15 and say, "I'm Paul Harvey with the rest of the story." And for 5 minutes, you're trying to guess who's he talking about or what's the company or whatever. And when I was a middle school teacher, I was the only teacher on campus who none of my students were ever tardy, because I always started class by reading a Paul Harvey story, and the kids loved it. But the problem with Paul Harvey is a lot of his stories are about like Fred Astaire and Sears Roebuck. Well, people today don't know anything about that. And so I wrote this book, Leadership Begins with Motivation. This was an homage to Paul Harvey, and it had more updated stories of people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. But then after I wrote it, Tom, I read it, and I'm like, huh, that's interesting. Completely unintentionally, I realized a lot of my stories were of white male Americans. And so then I wrote this book, Misfits and Crackpots. And most of the stories in this book are about women and minorities and international people, because I just think that inspiration is all around us. And I'm always, I was watching this horrible show on TV last week called The News, and it totally put me in a negative mindset. And I don't want that. So that's why I'm
Mhm.
constantly looking for people that are doing things that are making the world a better place. And so it's just a passion of mine. Really, one of the best books I ever read was The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt by Edmund Morris. It actually won the Pulitzer Prize. It's part of a trilogy. But I always tell people, you talk about a 6 year period in a person's life. When he was 36 years old, Teddy Roosevelt was the police commissioner of New York City. When he was 37, he was assistant secretary of the United States Navy. When he was 38, he led the Rough Riders up San Juan Hill in the Spanish-American War. When he was 40, he was elected governor of New York, and he didn't even have an affair. When he was 42, he was elected vice president of the United States. Later that year, following the assassination of President McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt became then and to this day the youngest president in American history. I mean, not a bad 6 year period, would you say, Tom? I mean, I've gone 3 months without getting a parking ticket. I feel pretty proud of myself. This guy set the bar pretty high. But the thing that impressed me about this book was Teddy was a sickly child, and so he spent all this time reading. He was a speed reader. He had a photographic memory, and he could read in 8 languages. They say by the time he was 30 years old, he had read over 20,000 books. And so when I was used to teach my kindergartners, I'm like, okay, what do you say? And they're like, wow. And I'm like, so we're going to read a lot of kid books. I mean, I still read 10 books a day. Many of them are pop-ups and scratch and sniffs, but I do read 10 books a day. But I can get inspiration from all kinds of things. And that's another thing I tell leaders all the time is it doesn't have to just be nonfiction. While I'm inspired by the true stories, fiction actually often triggers ideas in your head. So I believe you should read. You should, Auntie Mame used to say, "Life is a buffet. Most people are starving to death." Same thing with your reading habits. You should expand your reading if you want to expand your leadership.
Yeah, I agree with that. I love reading. I've got a fairly strong habit. I'm not on track with Teddy Roosevelt, but I
Okay.
do, and I do agree with this concept. I read a mostly nonfiction, mostly personal development. That's the space I'm in, but I like fiction, and I've got my favorites that I go to, and I've heard people make fun of this, but the truth is that once you read a book, if they ever make a movie, you're going to be disappointed in the movie most of the time. Sometimes they hit it, but most of the time they don't because they can't replicate what you create in your head when you're reading it. And
Yeah, when I
so,
was a teacher, I always insisted on showing the movies to the kids because the kids always said the same thing. They're like, "Wow, the movie's really good, but the book's a lot better." I'm like, "Yeah, I want you to get that."
yeah, yeah. Well, that's as an aside, one of the authors I read a fair amount of is Dean Koontz, and I've seen some of the adaptations of his, and they don't get it.
Not even
And
close.
so I'm really glad. But I am. The thing you'd have to know about me is that if in the disc world, if we're talking disc, I'm a very strong CS. I'm a very structure, very process. I almost don't care about the results. I care about the process.
Yeah.
And so I have processes set up for logging stories and keeping up with them and having things I've read come back to me. And do you do anything of that nature? Do you have systems set up to help you stay in there? And we don't have to go deep, but I'm just interested as someone, as a process person.
Yeah, so this will freak you out, Tom. It drives me nut. It drives everybody nuts that I do this, but I write in books like crazy. And then what I do is I dog ear the pages I think are the most important information. And then after I read the book, I take photos of every page, and I have a whole database of all of these pages. And then at the end of the year, I'm finding what were the 10 best things I learned this year. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm very process oriented like that too. An easier way to do it would to be reading on a Kindle and just highlighting everything. And there's all kinds of great note takers, great programs for that. Readwise is a great app for that. But I'm old fashioned. I like physical books, and people are annoyed I write in them, but I always donate them to teachers and to libraries. So whatever.
Yeah, I know there's probably science behind it. I don't know what it is. I don't really care what it is. The truth is that holding a book and reading it, and I do read on my Kindle. I read on the book. I'm not an audio person, but I don't throw stones at people that are. And it's the same with my planner. I love technology. I'm a geek. I've got all kinds of apps and things running, but I still have an analog planner that I operate it with out of every day, and that's how I run. Just because if I have an idea, I don't have to figure out what app to put it in. I can just run with it. And it's really the same, if I like the Kindle's ability to take notes, but at the end of the day, it's really easy to highlight in a book and put a little sticky note or something if you have to tab it or something. And I don't know. I hope it'll never go away. But anyways, back, I'm sorry, I was going to try to stay away from as many of these side trails as I can, but reading is a passion of mine, and I know it ties into this idea of storytelling because of the fact that as you read more stories, both fiction, nonfiction, whatever it is, you also expose yourself to more styles of storytelling. And that's a great way of conveying points. Do you have some method that you rely on to tag, well, if I'm trying to make this certain point, I've got some of stories right here? Or is that just something that you always know? You've got them on instant recall?
Yeah, so one of the exercises I do with clients, you can do this later, Tom, is get a pen and paper, sit in a comfortable chair with a libation of choice. And for an hour, I want you to write down every story that's ever happened to you. And I don't mean the entire story, I just mean triggers, like the time I locked myself out of the car in front of Costco, the time Dad spilled mustard on his tie when we went to that fancy restaurant. You'll find in an hour, you can literally come up with hundreds of stories like this. So that's the first part of the exercise. The second part of the exercise is then I want you to think about, what's this story really about? Oh, this is a story about never giving up. Oh, this is a story about setting priorities. Oh, this is a story about love. So on my computer, I literally have hundreds of files with tens of thousands of stories. So when I'm putting together a presentation and I need a certain emotion from my audience, I know exactly the story I'm going to use to evoke that emotion.
Yeah, that's a great way. I do something similar. It's probably nowhere near to the developed stage that you've got it, but you're speaking to a lot of people, and so you have to have a pretty good system for doing that. It's interesting you talk about that because when I can think of a couple of recent presentations that I did that. I think these were both on John Maxwell's material, but I was using a presentation that I had already established, had a lot of great information in it. But the thing that really resonated with the audience that I was talking to was when I then took what they were teaching and told a story that happened to me where I experienced something like that. Because at the end of the day, that was the thing that they remembered. They didn't necessarily remember the other stuff.
Yeah, people often think that you have to be extraordinary to be a good storyteller, and I would actually argue exactly the opposite. So, for example, right now I'm working with a businessman from Saudi Arabia who's climbed the highest peak on all 7 continents. He swam with sharks in Madagascar. He did the Iditarod in Alaska. And I look at him, I'm like, nobody can relate to you. Nobody in your audience has climbed Mount Everest, but I guarantee you, everybody in your audience peed their pants when they were 6 years old. It's a good story because ultimately, what you're trying to do is to connect in a way with your audience so that they see themselves in you, and they look up and like, huh, if Tom can do it, maybe I can do it. That's how you connect with an audience, not setting yourself up on this pedestal like, oh, my I have $100 bills coming out of my pockets, and my shoes are too tight because the diamonds are uncomfortable. I mean, nobody can relate to that person, but all of us, we can relate to the struggle. It's the biggest mistake I see in most presentations, Tom, is I tell people, stop sharing your successes. Start sharing your failures, because not everybody in your audience has succeeded, but they've all failed. And the more you share your own failures, the more your audience is going to see themselves in you. And that's exactly the only point of any presentation. JFK said the only reason to give a speech is to change the world. And he's absolutely right. Is the point of your presentation is to figure out how to get your audience to take your call to action. Now, your call to action, it can be an unpaid call to action, like subscribe to my podcast or vote for me. More typically with my clients, it's a paid offer like buy my product or invest in my coaching program. But the only way I measure your effectiveness on stage is how many people in the audience are deciding to take that next step. Don't get me wrong, I want you to move hearts, but more importantly for you, I want you to move the needle, because you are running a business, or even if you're running a nonprofit, you still have to fund that nonprofit and get donors and things like that, and have impact. That's the power of storytelling. I mean, and that's the difference between a good presentation and an excellent presentation. Good presenters, they tell stories. excellent presenters tell stories with intent.
So when you go in to help businesses along this line, um, do the leaders that you're working with generally agree that the storytelling is an effective component of their communication, or do they feel like that's not my job, or what do you run into when you're going into an organization? Maybe it's a mix.
Total resistance. They never think that it's going to be, and it's actually it's one of the reasons I love what I do, Tom, because when they recognize that it's kind of it's going to be a crazy comparison, but the movie Days of Thunder, Tom Cruise is the punk kid driver, and his crew manager is Robert Duvall, and he's resisting everything his coach is telling him, and Robert Duvall's like, all right, I want you to do a lap on a set of tires doing it your way, and I want you to do it on a set of tires doing it my way. And he basically is able to show him, he's like, look at your tire, look at my tire. This is how you're going to win the race. And finally, Tom Cruise realizes, okay, he knows a little bit of something. So I was working with a financial planner a few months back, Richard, and Richard, by the way, whenever I talk about my clients, I never give the real names. I believe in discretion. My co-founder, Coach Jimmy, he's from Broadway. If you want somebody to just name drop everybody we work with, just ask Jimmy. He'll tell you everybody. Um, but Richard, he used to begin his presentation. He's like, my name is Richard. I've been in the industry for 30 years. I've made my clients over $1 billion. I've worked with this famous person and this famous person. I'm like, time out, Richard. It's all right to brag, but you're doing it in the wrong part of your presentation. At the beginning of your presentation, you need to connect. And so we changed his presentation. So at the beginning, he talks about the very first client he ever worked with, Tom. And it's just this comedy of errors. I still have no idea why this person invested their money with Richard. And he noticed it immediately. The very first press. So the way he gets clients is twice a week he has a dinner at a steakhouse for free for about 15 couples in their 50s, and he's got like a 1 hour pitch to them, and he's trying to get them to book an appointment. And out of the 15 couples, so you always have to know your numbers. Out of the 15 couples, about 6 of them were booking an appointment with him, and of the 6 couples that booked an appointment, 1 would ultimately become a client. Well, we changed the story, and those numbers went up to 12 of the couples were booking an
Wow.
appointment. And of the 12, 7 of them were actually becoming clients. So it was a huge return on investment, but he noticed it immediately because I always say that there's 2 types of people in your audience. And I'm going to be stereotypical and say it's the husband and the wife. So the husband, I call Joe Friday. Joe Friday's sitting there with his arms crossed during your presentation, looking at you skeptically, like, who is this guy? What's he selling me? What's it going to cost? What do I got to do? How long is it going to take? An effective call to action needs to address all of those questions to appease Joe Friday. But a big mistake a lot of people make is they end with the call to action. Well, if you're ending with the call to action, you're ignoring the wife, potentially 50% of your audience, who I call Julia Roberts. Julia Roberts, she doesn't care how much it costs. She just wants to feel good. I listen to Tom's podcast because he makes me feel good. I learn all the time from Tom. And so that's why you need an emotional close. So the way that I work with clients, I mean, you have to forgive me, Tom. I'm a former teacher, so everything I do either rhymes or it's alliterative. And so it's the 5 C's process. And so we begin before we put together your presentation, we have to have clarity. There's 2 questions I always ask my clients. Who is your audience? What is the problem that you solve? Those sound like very basic questions, but you'd be amazed. 95% of the people I work with cannot answer one or both of those questions in a succinct manner. Oh, well, I work with men, well, also women, well, and like Christian, but they don't have to be Christian. And they can be, well, rural, they can be rural, but big city. You have no idea who your audience is. And I always suggest let's narrow it down. You can always expand your audience. So, for example, when I first started speaking, I had been a teacher, and so I spoke to teachers because that was my tribe. I knew their language. I knew what their problems were, and then I was able to expand my audience to parent groups, and then also to school administrators, and then I started going to masterminds, and business people started wanting me to speak to businesses. So I was able to expand you already used an example of one of the best speakers I believe is out there is John Maxwell. John Maxwell had begun he was a preacher, a minister, and so that was his audience to begin with. But he's been able to gradually expand from ministers to then he became leadership. His most recent book was on communication skills. So he's really expanded his audience to pretty much anybody. So you can do that, and then you have to have what's the problem that you solve. A lot of people have no idea what problem they're solving. One of my favorite stories was when Steve Jobs went back to Apple in 1997 and created the iMac. He had 5 features that he wanted to promote about the iMac. Well, one of his best friends was Lee Clow. Lee's the guy that created the famous 1984 commercial for the
Mhm.
Super Bowl. So extraordinary. And so Steve's like, I want to promote these 5 things about the iMac. And Lee Clow, what he did is he crumpled up 5 pieces of paper and he threw them at Steve at once. He's like, catch. He threw them and Steve couldn't catch any of them. And he's like, that's a bad ad. When he crumpled up one piece of paper, he's like, catch. He threw it at Steve and Steve caught it. He's like, that's a good ad. Translation, one problem. Let's focus on one problem. Same thing with your call to action. Always have a single call to action. I always tell people choices confuse and cause you to lose. If you look at the major grocery stores around the United States, Publix and Food Lion and Kroger and Ralph's and Smith's and wherever, whatever it is, wherever you are, they're not the number one grocery store chain in America based on volume. The number one grocery store chain in America based on volume is Trader Joe's. And the reason is when you go into one of these major grocery store chains looking for ketchup, there's 28 different types of ketchup. You go in Trader Joe's, there's one. It's called ketchup. They made the choice for it. You know, so always have that clarity. So clarity is the first of 5 C's. Once we're able to answer those 2 questions, then we get into the actual speech, which is to connect with your audience, to teach meaningful content that serves your audience, to have one clear call to action, and then finally to have the emotional close. So again, it's a very long answer to your short question, but I get excited when we talk about this.
No, and it outlines it so well. It's so perfect. That's the stuff that I had to learn coming out of a corporate environment into a solo entrepreneur business, is that you've got to know what you're trying to solve, who you're trying to target, um, and and identify a problem that people actually have. That really helps, because if I'm solving a problem that nobody has, nobody's listening. So there's a couple of applications, or at least one that I can think of, that going into a business, for instance, trying to convince a business leader of just these concepts, that you're not just delivering an address to an employee assembly, that you're trying to deliver a message. Does that resonate with business leaders, or do they struggle with that, trying to grasp that whole concept?
They struggle at first for sure. So right now I'm working with a 35-year-old CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Now, if you're a 35-year-old CEO and your board is all 50 and 60-year-old gentlemen, you're going to have a difficult time connecting with them. And so what we've done with him is his presentation when he introduced himself to the board the first time, he talked about all of the all of the menial jobs he had to take in order to rise up to being the CEO. And by doing that, he really made himself much more approachable to the board. They're like, where he basically acted like, hey, I'm not a know-it-all. I've worked my tail off and I need all of you to help me because we have one goal. It's to make this company the best in the world. That was an incredible approach, and the board appreciate. I mean, he had an instant credibility with his board because he humbled himself. I mean, I look at my Bible all the time, and that's the one lesson I get out of the Bible is, humble leaders become much more effective leaders. The braggarts don't really get there.
Well, they make a lot of noise for a little while, and hopefully they don't get very far. But that's about it. That was one of the messages or the lessons that I found was effective in corporate life, was trying to figure out, if you're addressing a group of employees about an issue, is before you even think about what you're going to talk about, try to figure out what is it that they really care about. They may not care about a lot of the sausage making that goes on behind it. All they want to know is how's it going to affect them. Donald Miller talks about that. If you're not talking to them about something that's going to help you thrive or survive, they're not listening. And so I
Yeah,
was
and
like
and
that.
And Donald's great. I love his story brand. I completely agree with him. He gives really good advice to anybody speaking is when you're on stage, you're the guide
The
and your
guide.
audience
Yeah.
is the hero. And I'm a complete believer in that process. And I'm a little
Yeah.
bit different from a lot of people that are teaching. I like to bring humor into the equation. A lot of people are going to teach you, oh, you got to talk about the worst moment of your life. And there's three reasons why I refuse to do that. I mean, first of all, the world just survived a global pandemic. Everybody's had a lot of bad stuff happen to them. I don't think we need more sad stories. I think we need more stories of hope and inspiration. Second of all, I'm teaching my clients how to create what I call a well-crafted story. Politicians would call it a stump speech. I've heard people call it a signature talk. You can call it peanut butter and jelly. It doesn't matter what you call it. What this is a presentation you're going to deliver again and again. It's going to become so ingrained in you. It's like the Lord's Prayer or the Pledge of Allegiance. You're not going to have to think about it. Well, do you really want to talk about the worst moment of your life again and again? I mean, I have a friend, his daughter was killed in a school shooting. He's told that story over 1,000 times. I have no idea how you talk about the worst day of your life again and again. And then third, and this is where people get angry with me. I have one basic objective when I'm on stage. I want you to leave feeling better than when you came in. I want you laughing, smiling, happy. I think there's something admirable about that. I believe the people that tell the same sad story again and again, Tom, by the 20th time they're telling it, now there's a crocodile tears, and now they're being manipulative. And I'm not saying it's not an effective sales strategy. It's actually a very effective sales strategy. But I personally don't want to have to take a shower after I get off stage because I just manipulated my audience. There are ethical ways to get people to want to do business with you. Uh, and I like using humor. So I love your background in engineering because I work with a lot of engineers. And so you and I both know engineers are introverted. They're not exactly the most outgoing people. They're very process oriented. And so we're working with a large company in Silicon Valley right now with their team of engineers. They're going through a VC offering right now to raise capital. And so one of the engineers I'm working with is the nicest Indian gentleman. And he came up to me. He's like, "Oh, Danny, please, please, you've got to make me funny. They're not listening to me." And so all we did for his presentation, so he's doing a 12-minute pitch for VC funding. And so he has a very difficult name to pronounce, Tom. I'm not going to tell you his real name, but so all we've
Okay.
done with yeah, all we did with his presentation, he now starts off, he's like, "Hello, my name is Shubhanakar Majahardin. Gee, I sure hope I'm pronouncing that correctly." And all we're trying to do is to get everybody in his audience just to smirk like, "Oh, this guy's all right. He doesn't, I take my job seriously. I don't take myself too seriously because I ain't all that, and neither are you, Tom. And if you think you're all that, teach kindergarten for a week. Those little ones will set you straight. I once had a little girl, LaShonda, raise her hand. She's like, "Miss Brassell, when are you going to trim your nose hair?" I'm like, "This afternoon." "Thanks for bringing that to my attention, LaShonda. I ain't all that." And so I like to bring humor. I use the movie Monsters Inc. as my research for it because if you look at Monsters Inc., they discover that laughter actually is more powerful than scaring people and fear tactics. And I just think the world needs a lot more laughter. I think it's a very effective storytelling technique too. By the way, whenever I use a politician as an example, it has nothing to do with the politics. It's just the example. But I always, there's a reason they called him the great communicator. President Reagan did so many things so well, but the thing that he did that every president has copied since him was when he gave a State of the Union address and had to deal with healthcare, he didn't talk about healthcare. He's like, um, there's there's Tom DeBell. Everybody give Tom DeBell a big hand. Stand up, Tom. And you stand up. Tom works at the GM plant in Louisville, Kentucky. He got injured on the job, but he didn't have health care insurance. And so he had a decision. Does he pay the rent or does he pay health care? So now everybody, when they think healthcare, they're thinking of Tom. That was genius. And if you watch every State of the Union, there's always at least 10 times where they stop and the president points to somebody in the gallery to represent whatever point they're trying to make. But it was an incredible, it's the story. I mean, of all people, it was Stalin who said 1 million people dead is a tragedy. A million people dead is a statistic. One person dead is a tragedy. He's absolutely right. Facts tell, but stories sell. Facts inform, stories transform.
Right. Yeah. That's good. That's really good. So we talked about. I want to go back to these 5 C's, the story blueprint, because that is actually something that you make available for people. I downloaded it. It's good. I'm going to have it linked in the show notes. It's a good reference to use just to get you started on that.
Well, absolutely. As a thank you to having me on the show to share all of my little stories, Tom, I wanted to give everybody a freebie. So if you go to freestoryguide.com, guide like a tour guide, freestoryguide.com, I'm going to give everybody their own complimentary, well-crafted story blueprint. What this is the actual process that we take our clients through on how you can create your well-crafted story. What this does for you is it takes the guesswork out of what story should I use and where should I use it in my presentation. And what this means for you is you now have an actual system that can convert your audiences into actual clients. You can get that at freestoryguide.com. And Tom, the time flies with you. Thank you so much for having me. I
I'll
really
have that
appreciate it.
linked anyway, so because I think that's a great thing. My whole goal in this was to essentially, for the few people in the world that don't know what you're doing, I want to make sure that we're trying to reach them, because this whole concept is so important. Is there any other final thought you'd like to leave us with before we wrap up?
Well, when my students used to leave my classroom, whether it was my little ones or my older ones, as they left for the day, they always had to hear the same refrain as they went out the door. I said, remember, kids, education is valuable, but execution is priceless. Knowledge is not power. Only applied knowledge is power. Knowing what the right thing to do and doing the right thing are two very different things. So let's go out, do the right thing, and make this world a better place. You're making the world a better place, Tom. I appreciate you.
Thank you. That's a perfect way to close this out. And once again, I just thank you. I've enjoyed the conversation. I could probably talk a lot longer than you'd be willing to, so I just leave it at that. And maybe at some point we can get back together and talk a little bit more about reading. But for now, we'll leave it where it is. So thank you.
I look forward to it.
Great leaders don't just deliver information, they deliver stories that connect, inspire, and move people to action. In this episode, Dr. Danny Brassell reminded us that effective communication starts with clarity, knowing your audience, understanding the problem you solve, and using stories with intent to connect emotionally and lead people forward. Be sure to check out the show notes for the free storytelling blueprint we talked about in the episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to subscribe to the Modern Leadership Solutions podcast so you don't miss future episodes designed to help you lead with clarity, intentionality, and confidence. If this episode helped you think differently about leadership communication, share it with another leader who could benefit from it. Remember, effective leadership is intentional.